we're working with our news sites to be a lot more clear about that word sponsored, because sponsored doesn't mean to the public what we think it does. When we talk to people about sponsored, a lot of times they're surprised, and think about it. So the way sponsored is typically used in the world, it might be like, if thinking about the Academy Awards, if somebody sponsors the awards or they sponsor your little kid's little league game, they're not dictating who wins the awards. They're not dictating the rules of the game. They are just putting their name next to it. So when people find out that sponsored content is really advertorial, they get upset. So this is one area we're really hoping for support from advertisers, brands, to use the terms correctly and clearly. When it's paid content, call it that. And if you have good brand integrity and good knowledge, like if you're considered a brand of excellence in a certain area, that's not going to hurt. That will only help. So, but if you're perceived as being shady, as labeling something not accurately, the harm done today is far worse than it may have been in the past. And I say that because there is so much fear and uncertainty about truthfulness, not just in advertising, but just in the world in general. Like, people have such mistrust, I think, in any kind of information, that this is the barrier that we have to break.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
I'm super excited to talk to Sally Lehrman today, who founded the Trust Project, because one thing that's clear in the marketing ecosystem right now is that journalism is in jeopardy, and just content in general is in jeopardy. So I wanted to start, Sally, with your origin story for the Trust Project and sort of why you decided that you needed to take the plunge.
Thank you. And then the phrasing "take the plunge" is really the right one. Because I'm a journalist, and I've been a journalist my entire career, working in all kinds of media, from print to public radio, documentaries, to magazines like Scientific American and others, really focusing on myself in the areas of science and social issues related to science. So science and society, and also business, because business is so much interconnected with science. But that's my journalism. And as a journalist, I've always been a bit, let's say, engaged in the reasons that we are journalists. Maybe because I didn't go to J school, I learned in the newsroom, so to speak, and kind of was brought up through by journalists, and I don't mean my parents, but journalists in the newsroom. I was pretty young, and the guys in the print shop would make fun of me when I got things wrong. So I was really cared a lot about our commitments as journalists, because I was seeing it every day. Commitments to being accurate, to being ethical, to stepping aside, let's say, if we had a conflict of interest in a story. And also, in particular, diversity, that we had made this commitment to bringing diverse voices into journalism so that people could learn about one another, express differing views, and come to agreement on things that might be challenging to society. And so all my career, when I saw that not happening, I wanted to step up and make a change. And I had the opportunity to do that through things like the Society of Professional Journalists and other organizations where really associations of journalists that provide individual journalists a chance to learn how to be leaders and to have a voice. Also Unity, which was a blending of journalists from all kinds of backgrounds together into one organization, was really helpful. So when I got this endowed chair post at Santa Clara University, and I was teaching journalism, but I also was doing other things. They had wanted me to strengthen or to make use of this strength that I have in diverse voices and in training news organizations to be more diverse in their coverage, and also the ethics that I have really developed more of an expertise in, thanks to my association with SBJ. And so what I did was I brought together a group of news executives from around the US that I had convened earlier as part of SPJ to talk about the advent of digital environment in news and how we had adjusted. So this was in, a little bit more than 10 years ago. And what surprised me then was that we were still complaining about the things that we had been complaining about 10 years before. And that was this concern that trust was declining in news, and yes, it was, and that we hadn't been able to reverse that trend. And instead of doing what I would call the right thing, so to try to respond to the trend by stepping up and being more transparent about who we are and what we do, or by being more careful about authority and integrity in the news, instead we were doing things like running more clickbait headlines, or posting a series of celebrity photos or mug shots in order to get people to come to the pages. And so the idea was, we're talking about these same things. We're really still doing the same things. Why can't we flip the picture? Can't we transform the news environment in this digital space to make it more responsive and to take advantage of the digital space? So can we get the technology platforms to do a better job surfacing trustworthy information? How can we help them understand what trustworthy news looks like? Can we make the changes in our own efforts to be more clear about who and what's behind the news and why that matters? So that's how the Trust Project came about. And when I think about it, I'm not really even sure like why I thought I could do it. People told me, oh, well, that's ambitious. I heard that over and over from funders. That's ambitious. Like, forget it. Don't even try it. But I would have none of that. So we went out and I was able to get funding to do user-centered design research and try to understand why people decide to trust in the news and why they don't, and how they make those evaluations. Why do they even care about the news? And out of that came 8 trust indicators that are now shown on 300 news sites around the world and growing. And the idea, again, is to help people know which news organizations are really committed to integrity and what does that look like, and to provide a set of tools to enable people to decide that for themselves, and also for news publishers to present that information. And people coming after our work have talked about nutrition labels even, and that's a lot of the concept, although we stopped using that term because I think it's kind of more broadly used now. And what it was so exciting about it, the whole enterprise, is that news companies really stepped up. So when I started talking to people about it, and like senior news executives, and saying like, we've got this trust problem and here's what I think we should do, they really did step up and sign up for it. And the technology companies also threw some of their a lot of interest behind it. And so that's really what gave us our momentum. And I'll stop there, but I'm happy to say more. I'll just say actually one little bit is that so any news organization that becomes part of the Trust Project makes a commitment to trustworthiness. And they also provide these 8 trust indicators on their pages. They're shown to users, and technology platforms can read them via code metadata that's encoded with each story and each site.
Yeah, it's a fascinating journey. I'd love to actually take a step back to the changing definition of the word news, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it used to be that news was less commentary based, and now a lot of what has the word news at the top of the screen, whether it's in print or in video, is really commentary on something that's been previously reported or something that happened, right? And it doesn't look the same as news did 15 years ago. 15 years ago, I think sort of news was often journalistically created. And these days, somebody breaks the news. Maybe it's Reuters, maybe it's AP, maybe it's one of the top 5 or 10 either broadcast publishers or print publishers, and then everyone else is just making commentary on it, right? And so they're really not doing much in the way of the heavy lifting side of journalism. They're still editors and reporters, but they're not investigative journalists, right? And so that's sort of there's this sort of sliding scale of, okay, well, at what point does it cross from news into editorial, into op-ed, basically, right, where it's really more commentary than it is news. Has that changed during your tenure as a journalist?
Oh, I think that's a really interesting point you're bringing up, and it's actually two things that you're describing. One is the blending of news with opinion, and
Right.
then the other is what really is news, which is where I thought you were going to go. But let's start with the blending of news with opinion. This was something that when I started the Trust Project, it was one of the things I thought I was concerned about, because I saw more and more commentary, as you say, being done by people calling themselves journalists. So it
Right.
maybe hadn't even blended as much into the written or the broadcast word produced by journalists, but we were still seeing this blending. And when we did our user interviews, that was one of the things that came out very strongly. People said, we have a hard time differentiating news from opinion, and we don't even think journalists know the difference. So that was a surprising well, not so surprising maybe, but upsetting finding.
Right.
And one of our 8 trust indicators is labeling. So it's separating news from opinion and being very clear about that, because this is one of the foundations of trust, is I know where you are coming from. I share your values maybe, or at least I know that there are ethics behind the work that you do. And one of those very important ethical parameters is that I'm clear and honest about what I'm telling you, that I am telling you something that's my idea or opinion, or I'm purporting to tell you a variety of voices and perspectives on an issue so that you can make your own decision. And that's what journalism should be, and the very best journalism is. And I think these kinds of disclosures, which have become ever more important in journalism, and we get lots of good feedback from users on it, and even news sites themselves, I think this is something that we need to move more into in the advertising realm. And I hope we can talk a bit more about that in a minute. But so labeling and separating news from opinion, that's something that we really need to do right now in this environment of building trust. And then the second part of your question, which is is the bigger one, maybe I should have started with that, which is, what is news? I find myself challenged by that, because when I talk about trustworthy news, I mean something very specific. I mean journalism.
Yeah.
I don't mean like news that my neighbor tells me on next door, let's say, or a blog or something. I mean something that's produced through this journalistic process. And so this is an issue we might have to think about from a journalistic standpoint, and anyone else who's listening or watching, that what is it we mean by these different genres? And by talking about it used to be media, like the news used to be media kind of meant anything and everything, but sometimes we meant news, sometimes we meant movies or television. News has become a little bit like that too. Like, am I talking about, when I say news, do I mean an influencer? Do I mean a blogger? Do I mean journalism? So that's something that, again, I really feel we need to sort out for ourselves and for users and the public. And then this other question of, well, what you kind of presented it in a challenging way, that well, maybe there really are only like 10 maybe true journalistic organizations, and everyone else is kind of just repeating, replicating the work. And that I have to disagree with you on, because the news ecosystem is actually very rich and growing richer in terms of content production. The challenge is that we're not seeing enough support of it, or even understanding of it, let's say, across the broader spectrum of entities that are part of the news ecosystem. And so by that I mean advertisers, brands, contributors even. So anybody in the public that's associated with news or is learning from news and goes to search engines but doesn't really think a bit more about like where did this come from. I think we need all to gather in support of this increasingly rich news ecosystem. And why is that? Well, that is because it's not just coming from the New York Times or from Reuters. I live in a little town on the San Francisco coast, and our newspaper is called the Half Moon Bay Review and Pescadero Pebble, because it was a merger between the Pescadero Pebble and the Half Moon Bay Review a long time ago. And like they are covering important issues to us, which have to do, and which are nationally, even internationally important. Farm workers, the farm worker housing. We had a mass shooting in our area a year ago. So these issues are so important to everybody. We have climate change issues. The road is falling in places because the seashore is washing in. So these are local reporters doing outstanding coverage that we need to pay attention to and in fact value, and not just pay attention when the New York Times picks it up, let's say. And I mean, I think everybody has a place in it, and is my point. And there are investigative news sites too. Lots of really interesting, important investigative news sites that we work with that are usually nonprofits, like iNewsSource in San Diego, and there's an Investigate Midwest and Investigate West. There's all kinds of organizations. There's one that focuses, like I think it's Investigate Midwest, that focuses a lot on farming issues. So I would love for people to be more aware of the very rich and blossoming news ecosystem that doesn't have the foundation it deserves. And I think we all play a role. Probably the biggest one place where we need help, of course, and health too, is the from the technology platforms and all these revenue sources that we really need. So part of why we think about news in such a narrow sense, I mean, in terms of news production, is because we're getting served up a very narrow set of news sources. So if I were to look, when I look at my Google News feed, for instance, I do see Reuters there, I see CNN, I see, I don't know, once in a while local news, but not the diversity that's out there. And that's harmful, not just to our perception of what news is, but to our understanding of what's going on in the world, in our own little world, like here in on the coast, but also in the Midwest, in Canada and New York, wherever people may be, we need to know about each other.
Yeah. Well, I think that, perhaps, I'm more exposed to the bad news because
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of local news organizations shut down and disappear.
Yeah.
Because my clients might have been advertising in them before, even
Yeah.
maybe probably not directly, but via programmatic stacks where they could just checkbox them. But, a lot of them were too small to have their own sales teams, but they
Yeah.
still published. But I've seen lots of those shutting down. Some of the biggies, I think it was BuzzFeed shut down its journalistic enterprise, right? And so that made big news. And so, I guess we've all seen the contraction of the space. I mean,
Yeah.
before I was crazy enough to try to buy Gawker out of the bankruptcy, which you can Google me and see all that journey to turn it into Gawker for good. I tried to
Yeah.
buy Gothamist and DNA Info, which included Gothamist, DCist, LAist, SFist, DCist. And Joe Ricketts had shut them down because he couldn't make the numbers work, right? He couldn't figure out how to get enough page views on the average story to pay for the enterprise, right? To keep it afloat. And obviously it's a portfolio. Some stories need to be written and will never get enough eyeballs to justify their production cost. And then you've got others that will get more than enough eyeballs to justify the production cost. And, oddly enough, the challenge that the industry faces is that sometimes it's the re-reporting of the news of what's going on with the Kardashians that gets the eyeballs, and it's actually the journalistic stuff that never pays for itself. So if a PE firm is in charge, what do they want to do? Less of the journalism and more of the, oh, look what happened to the Kardashians or the royals or whatever it is that generates the eyeballs, right? Or clickbait articles. And so I think, we've all watched that shift
Yeah.
over the years as advertisers. And we've also seen some brands become fearful of the news because of what we call brand safety issues, right? So there's that layer on top of news
Yes.
content that is not as prevalent with other types of content, but keyword based triggers where they say, oh, there's news about that shooting. So like a bunch of advertisers won't show up to advertise on that page, right? And so it puts yet an additional headwind on the publishing industry to report the things that need to be published. So I don't know what the solutions are to a lot of these situations, and maybe the Trust Project, right, is part of that solution, right? In that it's creating that framework that will allow journalistic enterprises to make ends meet.
Well, we can with the help of advertisers. Like we're not so much, we're working on the integrity side. And I agree with you, actually, Kevin. I think what you said about the business model is absolutely right. Like we're just seeing more and more layoffs of journalists. We are. And so these examples that I'm giving you are examples of those that are really trying to push against the tide. They're doing their best in an environment where we have, we haven't even talked about misinformation, but where we have it's very hard for people to find accurate news for the reasons that we just discussed, plus this flood of disinformation coming in from everywhere, including news sites that look like news, but are in fact completely set up, made up to promote a certain perspective, usually a hyper-partisan perspective, or now even deliberate disinformation. So in that environment where I think we can come together, like arm in arm with the advertisers and those that really rely on a healthy ecosystem, is by showing, well, what does integrity look like, and helping people really understand what that is. And really, from a brand safety standpoint, we know how important that is. We know that that there is the halo effect, that if you are, the flip side of being next to a negative news story is being next to trusted news information, even if it is negative, will provide this halo to the brand or to the brand. And so that's where I think we should be concentrating our attention. But I think what has happened with brand safety is that in this effort to avoid negative emotions with news, that advertisers went the wrong direction. So studies have found that it's not so much the negative information, at least more recently, that there was a study by Reach that found that negative feelings about news were not transferred to the brand itself. So, but what does get transferred is this idea that I'm looking at this in a trustworthy space. So there's more of an expectation on the part of the public to see brands in trustworthy places, and when they don't, then to associate the brand with that lack of trustworthiness. So that's where I feel we should really be focusing our collective attention and recognizing too, there's other data out there. We could look at the Edelman Trust Barometer. We could look at Reuters Institute report, both showing that trust in social media is what's going down. And at least in the latest Edelman report, it was also trust in owned media that was going down. But trust in media itself, news media, journalism, was at least stabilized or going up over last year. It was up about, I think maybe 3 points. So we see that in this very tumultuous environment that the public is finding itself in, it's tumultuous, both physical environment and information environment, people are gravitating towards things that they can rely on. We saw that happening during COVID. There were Reuters Institute also, again, was looking, and Ipsos also found what they called the COVID bump. So an increase in trust in that period, and also an increase in people going to the news. And I think we're seeing that same sort of thing right now, phenomenon where folks who are just in this tumultuous world, need something to rely on to be able to make decisions about their own lives, their communities, and going all the way on up to voting decisions, which we know like more than half of the world now is looking at a major election coming up in 2024. So people, they understand the stakes. And I could tell you a bit about our research on that if you'd like.
Sure. I mean, if you can summarize it, that would be fascinating.
Yeah, sure. So I told you our original trust indicators were developed out of research, trying to understand what people value and how do they decide whether to trust news. And there are these 8 disclosures that are shown on sites and also can be used as a media literacy tool. But we go back and review those, and we've had external research companies look at them. But most recently, we went and talked to people again about how do they decide whether they trust in the news and what do they do to do it. And we originally divided people into 4 user types. So we had a diverse group across race, class, gender, generation, geography. It was not a large group because this is user-centered design. So it's more along the lines of a typical qualitative research. But we could divide them into 4 groups nevertheless. And I think advertisers could relate to that. Like you have your 4 kind of profiles. One was the avid news user who's out there cross-checking the news. They're curating. Like we're not so much worried about them. They're skeptical, but in a good way. Then you had the engaged news user who, like one of them said, I grew up reading the Detroit Free Press on my daddy's knee. I still subscribe. I talk about it with my friends and my neighbors. Kind of feeling overwhelmed though by the amount of information out there and also underserved. Like she didn't see her own self in the news very much. And then the opportunistic, our character, their profile was a real person who's 29 years old, living with her in-laws in Phoenix because her husband's out of work. She's got 2 kids. She's working. She doesn't have time to look for the news, or didn't originally. And so she was just there when news washed over her, like popping up in a notification on her phone or in the break room at work on television. And then we had original research was the angry disengaged. So the angry disengaged has become engaged with falsehood and conspiracy theories. Everybody across the spectrum is more engaged, is more interested in getting information. And so that was the 2 big findings were that everyone more feeling like the more need to be informed, and then 2, more anxiety across the board. So more feelings of, I know there is disinformation out there, misinformation, and even the avid ones were saying, well, I can even get fooled by that because there's so much of it. And so worries about getting fooled, and then worries about becoming part of it, becoming part of this cycle. So this is what I call those 2 middle groups, I think, are the groups that we really should be thinking about. Anybody interested in accurate information. And I call that the anxious middle. Those are the people who don't necessarily have the resources to be able to get to the news that is trustworthy, or in some cases to evaluate it. So they could go to more the conspiracy side because that offers a type of safety, or we can help them with evaluating. Well, here, use these 8 trust indicators, or there are other ways of doing it, but to evaluate your news on your own terms and start being a part of the solution. So this is what we've been working on. And we did a campaign with Microsoft funded this campaign. It was a collaboration with the University of Washington and a group called Accelerating Social Transformation and the Radio and Television Digital News Association. And we just ran ads about the trust indicators on Microsoft Start and Outlook. And they're very, not at all scary or even asking questions, just very straightforward. Trustworthy news, for instance, we had one, separates opinion from news. Trustworthy news tells you where they get their funding. These are trust indicators. Trustworthy news brings you multiple perspectives. And then it linked to a page on our site with the 8 trust indicators. And what was great, people who got all the way through that process, and so came to the end, an ad pops up, or not an ad, a little survey, And 60% of people who answered that survey said they felt more confident in their ability to assess the news. And this is building this environment of confidence is what's going to help all of us. It's going to help journalism be able to survive. It will help the advertisers that rely on news to help bring people to their brands, to bring people to that trustworthy space that they need to be in. Building that confidence, building an awareness that we're all part of this cycle of trust, if you will.
Yeah, it's fascinating, for somebody who lives in sort of both the publishing and the advertising world. The Federal Trade Commission has always sort of advocated that influencers have a high level of transparency with regards to when something is sponsored or advertised, and certainly within the publishing world, advertorial needs to be similarly identified as advertorial and sponsored. And then you've got within the influencer marketplace, the brands are looking for influencers who are authentic, right? So authenticity is another important factor. They don't have a label for authenticity, but that is sort of a metric by which brands evaluate influencers when they think about, should I engage with them as a brand, as a sponsor, as an advertiser, and that those are sort of to some extent replicated in your labeling, which to me, indicates that there may be a little bit of a ripple effect, because you think about both the traditional search engines, I guess it's crazy to call them traditional, like Google and Bing, versus the next generation of search engines like Perplexity and the LLM based, in that it's useful for them to be able to identify information that is trustworthy and authentic, and has sort of a veracity score, right? And to be able to distinguish the difference between opinion and fact, or opinion and news. And it'll be interesting to see if you can reach critical mass, whether or not the AI LLMs in particular treat the ingestion of that information differently based on its labeling, right? Because an LLM that has not been properly trained may think ivermectin is good for different things than an LLM that's well trained, right? And that's just because of who said it and where it was said, right? And what information backs it up. And so there's like a next generation now of information retrieval, which is LLM powered, and then you've got the existing generation, which is Google and Bing, both of which I think could benefit from the structured data that your labeling construct provides. I wondered if you had conversations with those kinds of entities about your labeling schema and how it might be incorporated into what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in fact, we have, and that was that, and continue to. So this was one of the areas in which we originally started working with Google in particular. They were very interested in the markup language. So, and in fact, these tech companies, these platforms all operate with a language called Schema through schema.org. It's a community that you're probably familiar with. And so what we were able to do in collaboration with them is build a schema for news. So there's now a special language set that is specific to news. And I think that has helped tremendously and will continue to help news be surfaced, accurate news be surfaced more effectively. We still have work to do, as you were suggesting. Like, these companies will need to be making ever more use of it as they build with these large language models. Everything, and it applies to what we call the labeling trust indicators. So that gets to not just separating news from opinion, but also laying out, as you suggested, different types of content that may have funding behind it. So we have a whole set of funding transparency labels, which get to, and I think the influencers would be interested, because are you getting funds to produce this story? So for even a nonprofit, they may be getting funding to write about health issues, let's say from Gates Foundation, or during COVID, there were certain agencies that would fund it. Or are you getting funding from some big companies that want to see agriculture covered more effectively, let's say? So that's one kind of funding transparency. Another might be like what different types of paid content. So we ask for clear transparency around if something is advertorial, it's
Yeah.
actually written by or for a partner that's an advertiser. So really, literally calling it paid content. And we're working with our news sites to be a lot more clear about that word sponsored, because sponsored doesn't mean to the public what we think it does. When we talk to people about sponsored, a lot of times they're surprised and think about it. So the way sponsored is typically used in the world, it might be like, if thinking about the Academy Awards, if somebody sponsors the awards or they sponsor your little kid's little league game, they're not dictating who wins the awards. They're not dictating the rules of the game. They are just putting their name next to it. So when people find out that sponsored content is really advertorial, they get upset. So this is one area we're really hoping for support from advertisers, brands, to use the terms correctly and clearly. When it's paid content, call it that. And if you have good brand integrity and good knowledge, like if you're considered a brand of excellence in a certain area, that's not going to hurt. That will only help. So, but if you're perceived as being shady, as labeling something not accurately, the harm done today is far worse than it may have been in the past. And I say that because there is so much fear and uncertainty about truthfulness, not just in advertising, but just in the world in general. Like, people have such mistrust, I think, in any kind of information, that this is the barrier that we have to break and really be really strong about that. And then the other two, I think, get to providing, where, like you mentioned, where does the information come from? So we have one called references and one called methods that says, okay, not only just attribution in the story, but this is where we got our information, and you can look it up for yourself. You can do your own research if you want, and here's how. So those are partly to address skepticism and misinformation, and also to build that trust. And I just say, I really encourage those who are listening, who are working on the brand safety side of things, to think about brand honesty too. Think honesty in labeling, and really work with these news organizations that are stepping forward to try to be more clear about who we are and what we do and what does it mean when something is funded. It's not necessarily mean that it's not trustworthy. It just means that there's dollars behind it for a certain reason and a certain purpose.
Yeah,
They're not secret or hidden dollars.
yeah, that's really helpful as a construct, which leads me down another path, which is the sort of reemergence of sort of the concept of authorship, which had sort of a little bit of a blip a few years back, when there was sort of the idea of an authorship schema and understanding not just that it was in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or Fox News or New York Post or whatever, but it was who wrote it, who was the individual. And that individual could have been, a journalist or not a journalist. It could have been an op-ed. And it's becoming increasingly interesting from a sort of both a practical and academic perspective, because now a lot of the journalists, regardless of how you define them as a commentator or a journalist, they may still think of themselves or purport themselves as a journalist, but a lot of them exist outside of their broadcast or publishing partner, right? If you look at some of these sort of stars, right? If you look at their social media followings, their social media post of the story will get a greater view count than the entity of which they're part. They're the parent organization, right? And so that's like flips it upside down. So, it's sort of like the power dynamic between the journalist and the organization is also somewhat shifted, but also from the consumption of that content perspective and the grading of that content perspective, it doesn't only necessarily need to happen on the publisher or broadcaster site, right? It, to some extent, spills over into the social media construct and the platforms on which that content is shared first by the author and then potentially reshared, right? And because if those tags or that schema or that authorship information doesn't transmit its way through, right, to some extent, the person may not click on the link. They may not go back to the source. They may not be exposed to the tagging that is helpful in clarifying a lot of these ambiguities about the content, right? And so I think that opens up a big can of worms as it relates to, people consuming just the headline in a snippet, or a headline in an abstract, that's already been commented on, and it's gotten commentary in a social platform like X, or it's gotten commentary in Facebook, or it's gotten commentary in Insta, or whatever the case may be, right? It sort of really changes, where does the data live around that piece of content? Well, obviously, if it's at the source, oh, that's great, but that content has a life in and of itself, both due to its author and then everyone else. So, any thoughts as to how we deal with that craziness?
Yeah, well, I mean, you raised such an important point, and you're right. Like, as we're always scrambling to keep up with the new media and the new media consumption methods and the new media distribution offerings. And I really would like to see social media be more clear about origin, about provenance to users. And there are ways that we can work around that as journalists and journalism organizations, but really they hold so much power. So we've been talking with some of these social media companies to try to get them to be more clear. The search engines are probably the most forward thinking, I guess, in that area, that they really do care about context. And we've tried various experiments to try to show by context, meaning where did this come from? Who is the journalist? Who is the site that it's coming from?
Yeah.
And from a trust indicator standpoint, we do have these indicators live at both the site level, so it's about policies and practices at the site level, and also at the journalist level. So the journalist, I meant at the article level, which then provides who is the journalist. So the journalists, now we see information about journalists everywhere. Well, that was not the case when I started the Trust Project. We really pushed that, and I'll say the Washington Post, which is a partner, really helped us get that off the ground. But how does that then translate into these other environments? In a way, it comes right now because of the lack of enough being done by the companies that run these services. It really does come down to the user and this is why there are so many campaigns about like pause before you share. We know that's effective. Pause for a minute. Are you just reacting because it's fun, it's upsetting, it's interesting, and you want to share it for that reason? Or are you sharing it because you think it's trustworthy information? And if it is, how do you know it's trustworthy? So unfortunately, a lot of the onus is now on the user. And I think we, as the news industry, advertisers, and journalists themselves, can do things within the context of a post to show more about who and what this is coming from, and market, if you will. But right now, I'm not relying on the platforms to make the changes that are needed in order to make that happen. Happen at a mass scale. It's really up to us. It's up to the people who are part of this cycle of trust, this cycle of information.
Well, I certainly hope for all of our sakes that somebody embarks on an educational campaign to get the consumers to make more informed decisions, above and beyond the just pause before you share, to really then go and examine the articles themselves and, use the context and the tagging and the data that they'll find down those participating sites.
Yeah, well, and I'm encouraged. It makes it sound like it's such a tough job, but you know what? People really, in our interviews, we find people do look at these trust indicators on the page. Not everybody looks at all of them, and that's kind of the point. Like, the things that matter to you are the ones you should look at. And our trust indicator campaign, as I said, has been successful, and so we intend to do more of that. Microsoft is continuing to run that. We've got, it's now in 7 languages. in all the countries that speak those languages. So throughout Europe, US, Latin America, Canada, we've got these trust indicator campaigns. And again, I think this is where we all can pitch in. So not just laying it on the user, who some of them really get excited about it, our avid news user, or maybe building confidence among that anxious middle. But this is where I really hope brands and companies will step in and work with their employees and with their customers. Because if we can each just get people to look for one thing, like look to see who's paying for this, where are they getting their funding, or who is this person called a journalist? Are they really? I didn't mean that how it said. Who is this person calling themselves a journalist? Do they have a journalist experience or training, or are they really more of a voice, a commentator, which is fine, but we need to know the difference. Or are they blending news with opinion? Is what you're really reading opinion, which is fine, again, as long as you know that's what it is and are thinking about it in that way. And this is something that, kind of coming back to the brands and to the importance of advertising being part of this equation, that everybody can be part of. So advertisers can incorporate that in their advertising. Wouldn't that enhance safety? To be able to say, like, we really are making an effort here and we want you to be a part of it. And companies could be training their employees. Right now we have a collaboration with an international public relations group, association of public relations companies. And they've got this pledge on misinformation that we're part of along with the European Commission, or it's actually not the European Commission, it's one of the European bodies. But to get people to learn about these trust indicators and address their role in protecting ourselves and one another from misinformation.
Great. Well, I'm sure that there's you'll be keeping your LinkedIn profile up to date as new research comes out and new enhancements to your metrics and new members to your group on the publishing and broadcasting side. So I urge everyone to sort of keep track of you there and keep track of your organization on your website as well.
Oh, thank you so much. And I just add clarification, it's the Council of Europe. So that's a trust indicator too. And yes, you can find more about us at thetrustproject.org. And
Great.
there's a whole page on the trust indicators too. So thetrustproject.org. And LinkedIn is just at the Trust Project.
Right. Thanks, Sally. I appreciate you joining me. And thanks for sharing your journey.
Yes, thanks so much. I really appreciate those thoughtful questions.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.